Hey guys, how's it going? Companion here. So today we're going to go over the remaining cards of Blackrock Mountain. Blizzard had some kind of stream where they played some crappy decks for like an hour or so, but they got all the cards out. We got to see all the cool stuff that we're about to experience a few days from now, and I thought it'd be cool to go over the rest so we can see the fuller picture of what's going on in Hearthstone in the next expansion block. So I'm going to start off with the neutral cards because all the neutral cards that they hadn't revealed up to this point were legendaries. So let's kick it off with the legendaries. There's Chromaggus. It's an 8 for a 6/8 dragon, and when you draw a card, put another copy of it in your hand. So it's basically like you double draw every card that you'd otherwise draw. Now, if it costs 8 mana, it's kind of difficult to draw immediately. So there's that, but there's a few cards that they reveal that you guys will see makes this card a little bit more playable, especially in like Paladin, that kind of stuff. Now, there's not too much that you could do to draw cards otherwise. I mean, yeah, you could maybe have a few Loot Hoarders or an Acolyte of Pain in play, then you slam down Chromaggus and start trading to get that value off the board. You can kind of make it work that way, and it might be used that way, but it's not really a card that deals with aggressive decks. It's basically like one of the super slow control-y options. Basically, I expected every legendary release to be, and unless the game changes into a slower meta, which I am not sure that it will, this card will not really see too much play. But it's really cool, and I'll certainly have a lot of fun with it. In terms of arena, 6/8 is strong enough that it'll probably survive a turn, and getting that extra draw is pretty clutch. You don't often get to draw like too many cards in arena because card draw is fairly rare, so this card is maybe a little bit above average in terms of arena, so it's all right. There's certainly some cool things that can be done with this card, as I mentioned, but it really relies on a very specific situation in a game that you'd probably win anyway, so that's kind of the downer. Next up, we have Emperor Thaurissan, or I thought it was Thaurissan. I don't know. Fuck it. 6 for a 5/5. At the end of your turn, reduce the costs of cards in your hand by 1. So it's pretty nuts. The reason it's pretty nuts is, it's over budgeted. It's under budgeted for its mana cost in terms of stats. It's 6 mana for a 5/5, and that makes it kind of crappy on its own, but if you have any cards in your hand, you basically get that mana cost back. So this card is basically ridiculous, and there aren't really that many great 6-drops. Yes, there's Sylvanas, and then, well, yeah, that's about it. Any mid-range deck I'd expect would run this card. Any combo deck will really love this card because any decks that have a high amount of synergy will have this ability trigger at least once and make them have even more ridiculous combos. So combo decks, the very slow decks, and the very fast decks that have a lot of draw, possibly something like a Divine Favor Paladin, would really, really benefit from this card. I mean, imagine if your Paladin, your opponent has like 6 cards, and your last cards in hand are Emperor and Divine Favor. You just Emperor and the Divine Favor, you get like 6 cards, and next turn you literally play all of them, probably for no mana. So there's some ridiculous stuff that can happen. I can't really suggest any deck that would benefit from it the most, but I think a lot of people will try to make this card work, and I think quite a few of them will succeed. Then we have Majordomo Executus, which is a very interesting card. It's 9 mana for a 9/7, which basically makes it terrible because it costs 9 mana, and anything that costs 9 mana is generally terrible unless it wins you the game. And actually, this guy can do the opposite. His death rattle is to replace your hero with Ragnaros the Firelord, which sounds really cool. And you're probably thinking it's Ragnaros, right? Like the legendary Ragnaros. No. This guy replaces your hero with Ragnaros, so you become Ragnaros. And one of the screenshots from their stream, it actually happened this way. And the reason it kind of sucks is you have 8 health. Yeah, so if you play this guy and you have more than 8 health, and it gets like BGH'd, you actually significantly increase your chances of dying. So I don't think we'll be seeing much play of this guy, but it's pretty cool. I mean, some people will try to make it work. I guess I'll try to make it work because I like to make stuff work if I can. I mean, I really, really try to do that. But man, I have a feeling unless something disastrous happens to BGH, this card is not going to be very good because of it. I mean, your hero power becomes Ragnaros' end of turn ability. So every turn you can do 8 random damage. And you have 8 health. Did I mention you have 8 health? Well, you have 8 health. With 8 health, there's really not much you can do. In some cases, that 8 health will become a heal, and obviously an 8 random damage hero power will often be better than an actual hero power, but sometimes it won't. If your opponent is at 1 HP and you're a mage and they have a bunch of creatures on board, suddenly you kind of wanted to do 1 damage to his face rather than chancing it across all his creatures. So it has some wild scenarios, but most of them are awful. So this card is pretty bad as a result. In Arena, it may have some spectacular games, but in terms of consistency, there's probably a lot of other better legendaries to pick from. So another disappointment in the legendary department. This actually concludes all the legendaries released in Blackrock, and unless the game really slows down, that kind of sucks. But to be fair, I predicted this. I told you guys that all legendaries are going to be like 8 or 9 mana cost, and they're going to be completely unplayable if people keep playing like, Face Hunter and Mech Mage and that kind of stuff. So we'll have to see how the rest of the cards impact the game. So let's get to it. The remaining cards are all the class cards, and each class received, I believe, 1 spell and 1 creature, and one of them is a rare and the other one is a common. So the card here, the Paladin one, is Dragon Consort. It's 5 for a 5/5 dragon, so that alone is pretty good. I mean, you get the Holding Dragon ability, and the battle cry is, well, ridiculous. The next dragon you play costs 2 less, and this is not an effect that is like until end of turn. It's not like Kirin Tormage, for instance, where you have to play the secret that turn. This is literally the next dragon you play. You might play it 10 turns later. So this card basically enables some really cool combos. It makes it so you can play one of those 8 or 9 mana dragons and actually do something the same turn. So it's not something you often encounter, and it's really a big disappointment just because it's a Paladin only card. I thought a card like this should be neutral because it makes so many cool combos. I mean, imagine if it was a Druid card. You could do this, and then you have a 7 mana Malagos, and then when you have that, well, you can innervate a bunch of swipes and some pretty devastating things. Similar case in Mage. You kind of get the idea. Though in Paladin, it does make a lot of cards playable. A lot of people are really happy to know about combining this card with Chromaggus, for instance. You can play a turn 5 Dragon Consort and turn 6 Chromaggus, and if you have some of the draw card guys on board, or often just because it's turn 6 or maybe even turn 7 when you play your next dragon, it's a bit earlier than sometimes your opponent will be able to deal with it. So this card is actually like absolutely crazy. It will change Paladin in some way. People will try to play the dragon deck, and if the dragon type of deck is going to succeed for any class, it's going to be Paladin because of this card. So I hope it does succeed. I think it will. But in Arena, this card is going to suck pretty hard because you're probably not going to be able to get that many of the dragons. Yes, they introduced a lot of dragons in this expansion, but prior to this expansion, there were basically no dragons in the game. And, well, if you have no other dragons, and considering there are so many cards in the card pool, I mean, this expansion added like 30 to the existing 400 or 500, something like that, you're really not going to get much more in terms of dragons in Arena. So this card kind of sucks in Arena, but, yeah. What can you do? Next up is the Paladin spell, Solemn Vigil. It's a 5 mana Arcane Intellect. You get to draw 2 cards. But it has the cost 1 less mechanic, and it's similar to a lot of the other ones already shown in the expansion, where it costs 1 less for each creature that dies. So we know that Arcane Intellect is quite alright. It's played in a lot of mage decks, but it's usually played in mage decks that have a very refined purpose. So it's played in like Freeze Mage, it's played in decks where you're just trying to draw out those fireballs, those frost bolts. What you guys will notice is, with the card pool going up and up and up, it's kind of difficult to find cards that you want to remove out of your deck. And this card is a little bit weirder than Arcane Intellect because of the cost mechanic. And as I mentioned in the past, with the cost mechanic, it's very easy to reduce it by 2. So you can very often make this an Arcane Intellect. And if you can't, you're losing. And if you're losing, well, as a Paladin, you're probably dead. So yeah, it kind of works that way. I feel, though, that this card doesn't work too well with like the mid-rangey Paladin. I feel if you play a really fast Paladin where you can sack all your guys non-stop, it'll work. Or if you play a heavy control Paladin where you try to combo off Equality or many other board clears or activators, you can kind of make it work in that sense. So you can, like, you know, drop your opponent's board and then get this guy for free, or you can just trade maliciously with all your small minions and then play this guy for free. In the mid-range end of things, save for a lucky muster for battle, it might be difficult to reduce this past 2 mana, and if you can't consistently reduce it by 2 mana or more, I don't think it will be an easy include in a lot of Paladin decks, but, you know, it really depends on where the decks go. If people start playing slow decks, a lot of board clear, this card is suddenly going to see a lot of play. So it's kind of hard to gauge right now which way it's going to go, but it does have some options. Next up is the Shamans. The Shaman cards, it's a 4 mana 3/6, so it has the Water Elemental treatment, and it gains attack for its battle cry, and it overloads for 1. So 4 mana overload is a bit bad if you do want to play a lot of the other overload cards. It kind of knocks out Earth Elemental, but, you know, again, with BGH still being in the meta, unless that card sees some change, you know, you might not want to run that card. Actually, you might not want to run this card because it might gain that extra attack. But still, it looks pretty good. It looks really good in some cases. It's just the overload, it's kind of hard to gauge. So this card, at worst, is going to be a 4 mana 4/6 with overload 1. And in terms of stats, if you compare it to like Druid of the Claw, which is a 5 mana 4/6, it's basically the same as that. At that stage in the game, most minions have taunt if they're big enough. So yeah, it seems really good. It's just difficult to really gauge where Shaman's going to be at. It does feel like a very powerful card. In terms of Arena, I would really love to have this card. In Arena, you can sacrifice that tempo drop if you get a value increase. So in Arena, this might just be one of the best Shaman cards saved for Fire Elemental. And I look forward to that, because Shaman is really not that exciting to play, and this card kind of changes that up a little bit, where it's some flavor, and it kind of opens up a few things. Next, we have the Druid cards. We have Druid of the Flame, 3 mana 2/2, and you can choose to transform it basically to gain 3 attack or to gain 3 health. And this card, I actually really thought about this. I think it's a pretty strong card. Again, it's kind of hard to really know how it's going to work in Constructed, because right now the Druid decks are either really slow, filled with taunt minions, or they're playing some version of the Savage or Force of Nature combo, and this guy doesn't really work with either of those versions, so we'll have to see a little bit of a spin-off of Druid to make this card valuable. But I can say that the card in itself is a good card. It's a really good card, in fact, in terms of value, in terms of its spot on the mana curve, especially when it comes to Arena, is very good. So in Arena, when you're behind, when you want to play a 3-drop, you want to play a 3-drop that has a lot of health, and it doesn't matter if it has 2 or like 6 attack most of the time. It's just going to kill a 2-drop, and it's going to have some health left over. And the 5 health is pretty good, because if you're playing against a 1 damage hero, with their hero power, I mean, you can have this guy kill off a 3/2 creature, and it has 2 health, so it doesn't automatically die to his hero power. Now, if you're ahead on the board, you can play this guy in attack mode, 5/2, which seems really weak, but if you're ahead on the board, it's really attack that you want to capitalize on. So, you know, if you played a 2-drop, they played a 2-drop, then you trade the 2-drops, then you play this guy in 5/2 mode, suddenly your opponent may not want to coin out a Yeti for the turn 3 play or something like that. So it has some really good denial potential. And late game, a 5/2 often just stand its ground pretty strong. You can put this behind a taunt, perhaps, in the mid to late game to really get use out of that 5 attack. So it's an early game card that's good in the late game. And, you know, that versatility is extremely valuable in Arena. Whether that'll see Constructed play, We'll have to see what decks come out of the expansion, but I would guess not. The second Druid card is basically an Ironbark Protector that has some really nifty abilities with the whenever each minion dies kind of cost mechanic thing. 9 mana, 7/8 taunt. It's basically an Ironbark. Because it has 7 attack instead of 8, it basically means nothing. 7 or 8 attack is the same thing. Yeah, okay, if your opponent has 8 health, it's a little bit of a difference, but when it comes to trading off and killing creatures and killing the creatures that attack into it, there's very few creatures that have 8 health and not 7 that are actually relevant, that don't die like Big Game Hunter or other hard removal. So that part doesn't matter. You're really looking at it has a lot of attack, unfortunately enough to get big gamed, and as much health as an Ironbark. So the situation to make this guy cost less might be a little bit tricky as a Druid, because sometimes when you want to play an Ironbark, specifically in Arena, it's because you need to stay alive. Your opponent has complete board control, you have just a few points of life, you got to drop down a big taunt, and in that case, this guy can actually be a lot worse than Ironbark because, well, you need to play him one turn later. And sometimes if you need to hero power, get that extra health, you won't be able to play him at hero power on turn 10. That's if you're really, really behind. Now, if you're ahead, this card gains some value. It's just that because a lot of Druids play the combo type of stuff, you'd imagine it didn't really work with that stuff, but it kind of does. This card actually has synergy with Force of Nature. If you do use Force of Nature to clear, because you lose all the trees, if you kill... Okay, let's say you play Force of Nature. Let's say you killed 2 minions with Force of Nature, and you didn't have anything else. That's 5 mana discount off this guy. That means you could play him on turn 10 with Force of Nature. So one thing that Druid has really been missing are like these huge tempo board swing plays, and this enables that to happen. Whether people will start playing those type of decks, I'm not too sure, but it looks like this card might be an enabler. It looks like this card might allow Druids to play in a slightly different way, still with the combo because a lot of them need it, but you can kind of play a slower version of it with this card, and I think that might be very interesting. As far as Arena, again, usually want to play a big taunt when you're behind, but this doesn't really compete with Ironbark because it's a rare. It's just a pretty good big creature. So, yeah. Whenever you need a big creature that's pretty decent, if you see this guy, you're going to end up picking it. Hunters. So Hunters got their spell, it's Quick Shot. It's basically Dark Bomb, except better. Because we all know Hunters needed more direct damage and more card draw to draw more direct damage, to come up with more bullshit kills. I mean, okay, when you're playing against a Hunter, you're like on turn 6 with like 6 life left, and you're praying that he doesn't draw any damage because he's got no board, no creatures, and like nothing. And then at the back of your mind, now you're going to know that there's an option for him to get Quick Shot into like Kill Command hero power, and then you'd completely lose your shit, right? So apparently, yeah, Dark Bomb is not good enough, guys. Dark Bomb's not good enough. You gotta have Quick Shot these days, because 3 damage, which again, it's exactly like Dark Bomb. It's basically the same card, but better, for a class that's already frustrating enough and annoying enough to deal with. I'm not happy with this card. I think if you want to be creative making cards in a new expansion, this is absolutely not the way to do it. I think a lot of the control cards are too slow. Right now the meta is too quick, and this card just speeds it up so that people who want to play control will have an even harder time doing so. So, yeah. I hate Hunters. Next up, we have some Priest cards. We have the teeniest of the dragons. We have a Twilight Whelp. It's a 1 to cast 2/1, and the battle cry is if you're holding a dragon, you gain 2 health. Because it's a dragon, it's kind of cool because in the late game it's not totally useless because you can use it to hold as a dragon if Dragon Priest becomes like a thing, but I don't really know if it will. And in the early game, well, it's kind of a zombie chow. Kind of. Because if you play a Zombie Chow on turn 1, you don't really give a shit if it heals your opponent for 5. And the Zombie Chow has some combos in Priest with Arcanize, and that kind of stuff in some cases. So it just looks a bit weak, especially in Arena. Yeah, it's a little bit disappointing. I don't know. We might see some Dragon Priests, we might see some Zerg Priests with Dragon cards, and maybe it'll work out, but I am not optimistic about that scenario. Next up, we have the Priest spell Resurrect. It's a 2-mana rare card. Summon a random friendly minion that died this game. So this card incentivizes people to play mostly early game removal and then mid to late game creatures that then you can resurrect once they die. So the mechanic is really awesome. I really like Priest because it has the option to play that way already. It's just not very popular, it's just not very viable because a lot of people are playing aggressive decks, but if the meta slows down just enough, it might be possible to play in that scenario and it would make the card Resurrect extremely powerful. So Resurrect would basically work reasonably well because it costs 2 mana if you revive a minion that costs 2 mana, but it often doesn't work that way because a lot of minions have their value in, like, let's say their battle cry or in their position in the game. So think about it this way. If you have a 2-drop, you play the 2-drop, and it's good on turn 2 because it tackles your opponent's plays around that stage in the game. But if you resurrect even on turn 3, which is like, let's say the best possible time, you might resurrect on turn 10 and get your 2-drop, that's even worse. But if you get on turn 3, your opponent's 3-drop will often have a pretty easy time to deal with your 2-drop. So in terms of value, it's okay if it gets a 2-drop, but it's really not because of the timing involved. So you really kind of want to aim for, at the very least, a 3-drop. And you can kind of use it as one of the random cards where, if the average creature in your deck costs 4 mana, it's probably pretty good. And that's relatively good way of thinking about it. I think you can more systematically use this card if you have a specific strategy involved, and there might be some really big potential for such a card. You have to keep in mind when you play a card like this, there are certain cards that don't really work too well. Suddenly, if you Shadow Madness your opponent's garbage, you might resurrect that garbage at a later time. So if you're playing like a Piloted Shredder, the Piloted Shredder dies, yeah, you'd certainly want to resurrect your Piloted Shredder, but let's say the Piloted Shredder pops up some, 1/1 piece of crap. Well, you don't want to resurrect your 1/1 piece of crap. So, you have to design your deck around this card for it to be good, and you have to be able to play that type of deck in the meta, and that's really the question, but I think the answer to that question is probably a green light. So, I love it. Next up, we have the Warlock Demon Wrath. It's 3 mana, deal 2 damage to all non-demon minions. So basically, Blizzard really wants people to play demon warlocks. And I'm okay with that. I think Demon Warlock was almost a thing, but it used a lot of non-demons, and now with this card, you're incentivized to use more demons. The other Warlock card they're introducing is a demon, and yeah, it almost makes sense. So Demon Wrath is good in one end because, yeah, you might basically just do a Consecrate for 3 mana, which is super powerful. Warlocks already have a lot of board clears, so it's not that relevant in that case, but you can also strategically deal 2 damage to creatures that you want to take damage, like a Nerubian Egg, for instance, or perhaps you're maybe playing some kind of Enrage mechanics. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. There are some options to make this card awesome, so I think those will be explored, and it's a bit too difficult to decide whether that will turn out well or not. In Arena, I think this card is great because Hellfire is a good enough card in Arena, and I feel this card is just better. While 3 damage is often way better than 2 damage, 2 damage will often be enough, and if you're playing as the Warlock, and because Warlock is not that popular, at least right now as an Arena class, it's probably going to end up doing way more damage to your opponent's creatures than it is to yours on average. The Warrior card released is Revenge. So, Revenge is basically a 2-mana Whirlwind, and then if you have 12 or less health, you deal 3 damage. If you have 12 or less health for 2 mana, wanting to deal 3 damage to everything would mean that the game would have to have shifted in a ridiculously aggressive fashion. I hope I don't play that version of Hearthstone, honestly. And because of that, I don't think we're going to reach that stage, at least not too soon, hopefully. So as a result, I think this card kind of sucks. If you're at 12 health, this card might save your ass against like a zoo deck, but it might not do too much in other cases. Whether it will replace Whirlwind, I kind of doubt it. It is possible though, because Whirlwind often you just use to combo a bunch of stuff, and sometimes you just save Whirlwind until the end of the game when you want to combo with Grommash. And when you want to combo with Grommash, I mean, if Whirlwind costs 1 mana, Revenge costs 2 mana, it's still basically the same thing. If it hits Grommash for 3 damage, it's still basically the same thing. So it might see fit in Control Warrior, but I don't think the game will move to that much of an aggressive stage for it to be that useful. But maybe. Maybe. Last up, the Rogue card, Gang Up. 2 casting cost spell, choose a minion, shuffle 3 copies of it into your deck. And, you can choose any minion you want, so if your opponent has minions that you like, you can do that. So basically this card offers 0 immediate value, negative tempo because you use 2 mana for something that doesn't have any effect immediately. So it's kind of weird because Rogue is basically good at those first 2 things. Developing like a lot of board all at once and just getting really good value, really good efficiency from their card. This card does the absolute opposite. I imagine if you're running a Rogue card with a lot of draw, it'd be pretty decent. I imagine if you're running some kind of like Turtle Rogue, I'd imagine it'd be extremely powerful because you can imagine a case where you're playing a control deck, they're playing a control deck, you're probably going to deck out. Your deck is now going to have 3 more cards, and it's not going to have 3 more cards. It's going to have like 3 more Ragnaroses, and suddenly you're going to realize that that situation makes it so you can beat up just about any control deck. So if like a mid-range type of rogue can afford to slot in just another card that doesn't do too much immediately like Gang Up, it might see play in that sense. And if decks are overall just super slow, maybe you can just play this card in just about any rogue deck. It doesn't have to be really that slow. So it's a cool card. I love these cool cards, but if you're a hardcore rogue player, you're probably not too excited about this one. Overall, with the Blackrock cards, we've seen quite a lot of wild stuff. I think a lot of it might be for nothing in terms of the competitive scene, because I think the game might continue to be at least as aggressive as it is right now. And all the cool cards that you wanted to play in GVG, all the cool cards that you're going to want to play out of Blackrock that you've just seen, you're just not going to be able to play them competitively, so it's a little bit of a bummer in that sense. But, you never know with these things. A lot of people have been wrong, including myself, so I guess there's some level of optimism to hold. But for me, I'm a player that seeks fun in Hearthstone, so I will test most or all of these cards as thoroughly as I can, and we'll see, eventually, just how good they will be. So, until then, I hope you guys enjoyed my review. Hope you guys are as excited about Blackrock Mountain coming up in a few days as I am. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.